So, how do you compare two different games? Well, you have to do it subjectively, which for this video means it is no more than just my opinion. But it is a bit like comparing two very different people. And then asking yourself, of those two people, who would you like to hang out with? Who would you like to be friends with? So DayZ for me is a bit like a middle-aged man who's pretty comfortable in himself nowadays, but has had a bit of a troubled past and sometimes sort of lets people down around him, but can be pretty cool to hang out with. He may feel in his prime, but he goes for a run and, well, his body aches all over. SCUM, on the other hand, makes me think of a young chap trying to find his way in the world. He has a job, but is it a career? He's unsure, as he's never really quite found his inner self. His life is still mostly ahead of him, but he is not quite sure what path to take. Now, if any time during this video you enjoy what you're seeing or you like it, drift your eyes, your finger, your thumb, whatever, down to that subscription button. I would greatly appreciate it. DayZ, been around for a while now, 7 or 8 years. Bohemia Interactive is a developer. As I said, a bit of a troubled upbringing. SCUM, on the other hand, just over 2 years in development, still in early access. Game Pyres is the developer. They have some big plans. It's going to be what I would describe as a very interesting 2021 for these two games, and this is going to be a bit of a face-off video. What do I think of these two games? Just to make it crystal clear, I'm not going over every single aspect of these games. I'm going to be looking at what I'll describe their fundamental personality traits. This video isn't going to be super short, so I've broken up the YouTube bar at the bottom into sections, and you can jump to various things which you might find interesting. Okay, let's start off with the overview. Well, the concept of DayZ is simple. You wake up on a beach with virtually nothing. Your character has no skill system, and the only skills that count are those that you as a player bring. And after spawning in, you must start to loot buildings, scavenge from the land whilst avoiding the wandering undead. And of course, you've got to keep an eye out for other players who may be friendly or hostile. Now, players are always enticed inland, with the better loot and gear being found at military bases and airfields generally found away from the coast. Survival in DayZ is notoriously difficult for the beginning player. This is due to multiple threats, not least of all being the weather and diseases, which will afflict you, the player, if you're not careful. And also for the new DayZ player, starving to death is a really common occurrence. DayZ in itself has no specific what you would describe as win state. And if it did, it would probably just be to survive the longest, and that really isn't a actual win state. It's just something that you can achieve in the game. SCUM has a similar gameplay concept, except perhaps I would say it is a bit more defined, being that you have a choice over your character creation, and there is a skill system that will develop as you play. For example, a driving skill which might start off quite bad over time will improve, and it does affect the gameplay itself. You are dropped into a Hunger Games-like environment where the objective is to gather fame by surviving the longest, killing other players, crafting and building, and occasionally competing in in-game events. Now, despite the more defined parameters, the general gameplay on an average day pans out in a pretty similar way to DayZ, with players moving off the coast inland and seeking higher tier loot and surviving, or trying to survive, the longest. SCUM has far more what I would describe in-game focal points than DayZ, with things like high-tier loot locations being protected by wandering robot sentinels and lots of military underground bunkers and daily supply drops. There's what I would describe in an average day for the average player. There is probably more in SCUM to keep yourself occupied more than in DayZ, which is pretty simple, and at which DayZ is really only about surviving a post-apocalyptic wilderness. On a multiplayer server, a win state for SCUM does sort of exist, and that is essentially that you can go to the top of a fame points leaderboard. But that's about it. The next thing is player interactions. Despite both DayZ and SCUM having similar survival concepts, meaning that if you are killed you lose everything on you and you have to respawn, the enemy or other player interactions are, from what I've seen, quite different between the two games. DayZ is notorious for a kill on sight gameplay. There has been some talk that has softened recently in the last 6 months or so, but overall, kill on sight is the general way that the game does pan out. It happens most times, and when it doesn't, there's still a lot of distrust of other players. This generally stems from a long established in-game DayZ culture of kill on sight, which comes about for two main reasons. For really well-geared players in DayZ, there just simply isn't anything else to do. You just have to wander around killing players because you've done everything else. And two, if you don't have too much gear, if you kill another player, you instantly get all their gear, which in DayZ can be really difficult to find. Gear can be quite hard to come by. So player interactions in DayZ can be extremely exciting, but that's mostly due to the threat of death. But they also, on the other side, lead to what I guess you'd call a lot of rage quits and anger. Well, they certainly have for me over time anyway. SCUM does not quite have the same kill on sight mentality, despite it being a Hunger Games type of situation. This is because established players generally won't need much from you, and they actually get few fame points for killing early players. Oh yeah, I surrender. There is a bit more to do in game, and gear and loot is a bit easier to find, and you can build bases easier in SCUM, meaning therefore that you can store loot in greater quantities, so it's a little bit easier to keep loot on board. A little bit easier than DayZ anyway. Player interactions in SCUM I'd consider a bit kinder, but they're still pretty dangerous. Oh, come on! That's bullshit. That's bullshit. Absolute bullshit. For me, playing DayZ, and when I think about player interactions, it feels like a constant whisper of terror every time you exit a building or see some sort of movement. And to be honest, I'm not actually sure this constant tension is all that good for me, so I personally prefer the SCUM dynamic, but I do appreciate that they do both have their strengths and weaknesses. The learning curve. Now, when I was trying to come up with a description on comparing how hard a game is to play, I realised that it wasn't about how hard the games are, but how hard the games are to learn. And there's a difference. As for both games, after you've mastered the basics, both are relatively easy to survive in if you take your time, play it safe, and avoid other players. But what really makes a game hard, so to speak, or puts players off, is when a game is really, really hard to start with. So that early way the game pans out is very important. I've recently seen several videos on how DayZ is the hardest game ever designed. Well, it sort of is and it isn't. DayZ is absolutely a hardcore survival game. It is a key concept that the environment itself should be brutal. But when we ask our question about how hard a game is to learn, we should actually rephrase that question to this, and that is, how do players actually learn how to do things in the game? Now in DayZ, I'd say that the majority of learnings on how to build things, how to craft items, how to fish, survive, and other things like this are learned through out of the game itself, actually in YouTube searches. Now, the reason for this is that the in-game interface is designed to not hand feed you, but to make players, well, basically figure it out for themselves. Now, I think that is admirable, but even I have to look at tutorials quite often, and I've played the game a lot. And I'd say that this has meant that if you stay purely in-game and just learn through trial and error, well, to be honest, you are in for an insanely hard road to learn DayZ. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about this in the UI section later on. And when it comes to SCUM, well, the first thing is that it should not be underestimated how many things there are to learn and do in SCUM. The building and the crafting list is sizable, to say the least. However, as the concept of the game is that you are dropped into a reality show, there is actually an in-game tutorial, an AI guide of sorts that tells you how to do the basics.
Secure communication with human asset established.
And after this, the items that can be crafted and built are pretty clearly shown to the player, and the items required to build them are laid out in front of you. The system is much more presentable to the player. Now, SCUM has definitely taken a different approach here to DayZ, preferring to help the player and take away some of the guessing. The learning curve is definitely a lot softer than DayZ, and I judge that because I personally had to YouTube tutorials for SCUM a lot less compared to when I play DayZ. Immersion. Now, this is a big one and in fact covers many aspects of game design, so I'm just going to give a brief overview here. DayZ takes the approach of the landscape or map being very large, making it feel very open world, with large expanses and big cities with rain, wind and cold all being very visceral to the player. It takes the approach of minimal on-screen feedback to the player and provides clues to what's going on with character animations like shivering, vomiting and blurred vision. Now, the graphics themselves are solid. It's a Bohemia Interactive's own engine, so it's been designed fit for purpose, but it's taken a long time for the get to graphics up to what I'd consider to be a decent standard, but they're pretty atmospheric. The ambient sound is good and it does change with your environment, and the gunshots and certainly the variety of the sounds that they make and the way they change from the distance away from the actual shot, well, they would be some of the best I've ever seen done in a game, and I know back in the day they spent an awful long time working on that. But if you were to play DayZ in classic hardcore mode, and that being first person only, and not ever looking out of the game like YouTube for references on how to build things, well, DayZ is very immersive in that respect. But the lack of feedback for new players will often lead to confusion as to what is actually happening and can actually lead to a lot of disillusionment with the game. SCUM, well, it has a smaller map, but that is due to be expanded in size significantly very, very shortly. But regardless, even right now, it is a large enough field to make it quite open world, but of course you are playing in an environment with walls around it, but within that it does feel quite open. More feedback is provided to the player through on-screen prompts and icons, and the metabolism system, well, it provides huge amounts of details as to what is happening with your character, not just their food, but you also have what their health is, all the various skills they've got, the progress there. It's very, very detailed. The in-game sounds are very solid, and the ambient sounds are very good as well. With the amount of feedback provided to the player on what is going on with your character, the SCUM developers have praised themselves as saying that this is the most advanced management system, the most advanced character management system ever created. And in many regards, it is actually quite intriguing to study that part of the game, and it can be a bit of a mini game in itself. But perhaps at times it can feel like your character is some sort of, I like to think of it as like an advanced Dungeons and Dragons creation with stats and data all over the place, which if you don't really understand it, well, it can be a bit confusing and look quite a bit of a mess. And I'm not really sure that actually adds to the immersion of a game. Now, I'm just going to quickly move through some of the other key concepts of these two games. Now, these are just my opinions and people will think what they want on these, but I'm going to start off with inventory and item management. The DayZ inventory management tries to replicate what it would be like to do things in real life. Well, it sort of tries to do that, because obviously it's still a game. For example, the loading and unloading of guns, the opening of cans of food, well, it can feel quite extraordinarily clumsy for a long period of time until you get used to it and you start to get your head around it. And when that does happen, you start to see that there tends to be a similar set of rules or processes that you have to apply to get things done through the inventory system. However, I will say that compared to other modern games, it still feels really antiquated, and in particularly the inventory management system, which has been brought up to speed but often doesn't feel quite right. It feels clumsy. SCUM's inventory management system, I would say, is far more advanced and user-friendly. And when you play it, it seems to make a lot more sense and is far less confusing than DayZ's systems. Over the years, DayZ has had a lot of problems getting the AI right on the zombies. However, 7 years later, it now works relatively well. The aggro settings are pretty good, and they do encourage sneaking. Individually, the zombies are not that much of a problem, but when they get together in a pack, they can quickly overwhelm you, which is what you want. However, it is not all good. The zombies suffer from very much a sameness feel, meaning they all pretty much act and behave the same and are quite predictable. And to this day, they are stumped by simplistic avoidance techniques, and including you can just stand on raised objects to baffle them. Also, the very, very clumsy melee system, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly, makes interacting with the zombies, normally obviously combat, feel really false or ridiculous. And for a game this old, the zombies, quite frankly, are just not where they should be. Now, in SCUM, the zombies are called puppets. They are reanimated dead players, so to speak. Compared to DayZ, the puppets are significantly more advanced. The aggro AI is good. It feels right, I guess. There is a wide variety of the puppets, from fat, slow ones that are really hard to put down to skinny, fast ones. And you'll also see puppets with suicide vests. And my favourites, which are the fat, armoured, ex-military puppets, who really take some hits and are really tricky to put down on the ground. Now, the AI is not perfect, and to make them more challenging, it would be nice to see them able to damage doors and climb through windows, but overall, the puppets are actually really good, and to be honest, much better than the DayZ zombies. Let's talk about early game wilderness survival. Now, for me, this is one of the key weak areas of DayZ, despite it actually being a hardcore survival game based back on the day on Dean Hall's army training out in the wilderness. The flaws here come about due to the need to find tools to craft things. You need to find axes, hatchets, saws, other things like that to be able to do anything even moderately advanced, meaning you always have to go into town. Now, that might be a game design actual plan, but it doesn't work very well because you can't survive in the wilderness. You have to keep going into town. But on top of that, DayZ can often feel quite barren with little wildlife like birds, rabbits, things like that. And if you aren't in an area where cows or sheep spawn, frankly, good luck finding anything to hunt in the wild. SCUM, on the other hand, offers players a real wilderness experience if you choose to play that way. You're able to craft a variety of really primitive tools from readily available materials like wood and stone. And you can also go all bushman-like and craft clothing from kills. However, the mechanics of cooking food in the wild I should say, raw versus cooked, wild foraging does require quite a bit of work, so it's not perfect. Right, next up, let's just talk very quickly about melee. Now, DayZ's melee system is appallingly clumsy, and let's be honest, is almost laughable in its application against zombies and other players. It's dreadful. SCUM's system does require some getting used to, but once you get the hang of it, well, it is pretty smooth both against puppets and other players. Yeah, SCUM is far more advanced than DayZ in that regards. Gunplay. DayZ has spent a lot of time working on its gunplay mechanics, and they actually work quite well. The thing that lets them down primarily is that the servers aren't very responsive, and if you have a lot of players on board, it gets really hard to do anything with a gun. It becomes almost random, I find, in your ability to shoot. But it is very good in the regards that your player skill is what counts, and if you're very good at PvP and DayZ, then you're good at it. But it is a little bit tricky with the server, the lag times, the way the characters move, and the sight mechanics. They are tricky to use, but it's quite realistic. It does feel realistic, it feels quite visceral, and I do like that aspect of it. I'm going to let this clip run, and you're going to see the issues with DayZ gunplay. He's going to pull out his pistol shortly. I'm going to dodge and weave rapidly from side to side because this is the way you dodge bullets. Tiny lag, and my dodging really makes it very hard to hit me. I get close, get the better of him in the melee, and to be honest, this poor bastard would have absolutely every reason to be well and truly pissed off with the game, and he should be. Now, SCUM's is maybe not quite as advanced, I feel, as DayZ, despite the fact that when you do get into the gunplay mechanics, they are detailed. But maybe DayZ's had 7 years to design it, so you would expect that particular aspect to be good because they did focus for a long time on it. However, SCUM gunplay dynamics are very good, they're very solid. The servers tend to be a bit more responsive, so it feels you're more connected to the game when you're using your gun. It works very well, and there are no real problems with any of the gunplay within SCUM that I've seen. Transport. For many, this has been a huge fault with DayZ since its standalone implementation. The concept over many years has not changed that much. Vehicles do spawn in, but pretty rarely, and they need to be repaired to make them usable. The problems with this model were obvious early on. The map is huge, and so access to transport is very beneficial. But to be able to find all the parts required to repair a vehicle was extraordinarily difficult. You could not repair it piecemeal, as other players would simply take the parts off that you had put on and hide them, with everyone simply having the same idea. Secondly, when you really did get a car, the desync and the lag would often be crippling. The handling of the vehicles also feels like a kid's inflatable raft being steered by people using inflatable paddles. It's that bad. Now, 7 years into the game, it is obviously better than it used to be, but it is still very far from what should be in place. Transport, that is vehicles in DayZ, has overall been appallingly handled and delivered by the developers. Now, in SCUM, it is generally much easier to find vehicles. Typically, you will find things like quad bikes, tractors, or police vehicles, four-wheel drives, that type of thing. These will often require some repair to make them usable, but not always. Normally you will find them with flat batteries which you can charge up, or they might be damaged quite severely, so you will have to repair them, but you could still drive them. But often they have quite low fuel supplies, so you're going to have to get them to a petrol station. There is some desync and lag, but it is nowhere near as bad as DayZ, and it's perfectly playable. The handling of the vehicles is okay, they still feel a bit floaty and not connected to the terrain, but overall it's not too bad. Vehicles in SCUM, I actually think they've got it just right. So I've tried to give there a bit of an overview of what the games are like right now, but we are of course in 2021 heading into the future. DayZ for me has pretty much done its dash. It does have a few more things coming out, like they just recently released a new map and the modding community definitely keeps it alive. And on that note, the community of DayZ is way bigger than SCUM, so there's a lot of activity in that space, and so it can be exciting to get into the world of DayZ because there's a lot going on, but you will always be frustrated by it at the same time. SCUM in 2021, they are still very much in the early stages of their development cycle. They've got map extensions coming up, they've got all sorts of bits and pieces planned. It's very, very exciting to see where SCUM would go. If right now in 2021 I had stocks and shares and I had to invest in one company or the other, meaning how are you going to spend your money, I'd probably put it into SCUM because it has future potential. DayZ has done its dash. The future potential for SCUM, I would hope to see it go down the path of more exploration of the fame points, making it feel like you're in a competition, less about the metabolism that is a distraction, tidy up some of the flaws there, that would be good, but really make it feel like you're in a game because it does lack that a little bit. So I guess for SCUM, they really just need to capture that very unique flavour that it can offer and really develop that to capture a big audience, but I do think it's got a fantastic 2021 ahead of it. Finally, if you've got this far and you've watched this whole video, you're a bloody legend because most people won't get past the first 2 or 3 minutes. YouTube stats show that. Like, subscribe, all that great stuff. I've got a Twitter, I have a Discord, the links are below. It's been fantastic talking to you. This video has taken a bloody ridiculous amount of time to put together, and I do hope you find it beneficial. I will see you in the next chapter.